Okay, okay. I know what you're thinking. You saw the title to this video and you're thinking, oh no, this is going to be some silly clickbait nonsense. And yeah, okay, maybe I wanted to do a little fun video for the holidays. Maybe this video is going to be a little tongue-in-cheek. And yes, I'm not going to deny it. There's something fundamentally absurd about comparing the holiday classic Miracle on 34th Street to the gritty HBO police procedural The Wire, but bear with me here because I actually think that there are some surprising points of commonality between the film and the series. And as much as this video is fundamentally a silly little Christmas joke on my part, there might actually be some insights to be had by comparing the two. So one of my family's ongoing holiday traditions is that every Thanksgiving, after we've finished the turkey, after the sun has set, and after everyone is completely bloated and lethargic, we all settle down and we watch Miracle on 34th Street. Not the remake from the 90s, but the 1947 original, the one in black and white. And it's one of the few Christmas films that I feel really holds up, at least for me as an adult now. And I think part of the reason for that is that it just feels a little more sophisticated and a little more intelligent and a little bit more adult, not in a bad way, not adult, but it feels a little bit more mature and thoughtful than your average Christmas film, while still being a purely enjoyable family entertainment. This is not a case where this is. It's obviously not some bleak, dark existential film, right? It's still very much a largely wholesome family film that's perfect to watch with your parents or your grandparents or your aunts or your uncles or your nephews or your nieces or your cousins or whatever on Christmas. But it has just a little bit of sharpness to it, just a little bit of a clever edge, and just this underlying strain of slightly dark, slightly mean spirited humor that just makes the whole thing come together and work. So this year, for some reason, probably because my brain is fundamentally broken on some level, while I'm sitting there watching this film for the umpteenth time, I have no idea how many times I've seen it, a thought popped into my head. And the thought was basically, this reminds me of The Wire a little bit. Now you might say, that's a pretty weird thought to have. And I will grant that, yeah, indeed, it is a pretty weird thought to have. But I think what planted that weird thought in the back of my mind as I was watching Miracle on 34th Street is the way that it seems oddly similar in structure and approach to The Wire. So to dig into this, let me start by talking about how The Wire is structured as a series. So the series starts off in its first season not exactly as a standard police procedural, but definitely as a police procedural. It's following very closely the lives of detectives and drug dealers and beat cops in Baltimore. And that's the hook for the first season. But something interesting happens as the series goes on, and that's that its scope just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. And the show keeps growing to encompass more and more of the city of Baltimore and to show us more and more of its corrupt institutions. In the second season, the series adds the docks, and we get to learn how they serve as this kind of point of entry for all the illicit substances that are pouring into Baltimore. And then in the third season, we get to see City Hall and the city government and how all the decisions that are being made on a political level in the city are adding to its corruption and adding to its problems with crime. And then in season 4, we get a look into the public school system and we get to see how its failures are facilitating the poverty and the decay of the city and the hopelessness of many of its residents. And then in season 5, the series expands to look at the newspaper industry, to look at the media, and how crime is spun, and how the tendency towards sensationalism in the media prevents people from really learning about and really addressing the real deep, pervasive institutional problems in the city. And so with each season, the series keeps growing and expanding outward, and we get these intimate little peeks into these different facets of Baltimore as an ecosystem, and as an ecosystem that's festering from the inside from deep, deep corruption and deep institutional rot. And as the scope of the series continues to expand, so do the number of characters who we get to meet and who we get to be closely acquainted with. It's not as if the series sticks exclusively to one fixed core group of characters as it explores all these different institutions. Instead, we get to meet different characters who live within these different institutions, who live within these different worlds within the larger world of Baltimore. Okay, all right. So what does this have to do with Miracle on 34th Street? Well, well, actually, Miracle on 34th Street is structured in a very similar way if you think about it. It starts off in many ways as a very traditional Christmas film, focusing on exactly the kinds of characters you would expect a traditional Christmas film to focus on. There's a single mother and her daughter, her precocious daughter. There's the love interest for the single mother, who happens to be this kind of friendly, lovable, attractive bachelor character. And then, of course, there's that element of Christmas magic. There's this elderly gentleman who believes he's Santa Claus. And there's a very traditional movie you could make from that that would focus exclusively on them throughout the story. And in fact, the many, many imitators that have come along to try to ape this formula since the 1947 original was released have mostly stuck to exactly that format. You have a lonely single parent, you have a precocious child, you have a love interest, you have some external source of potential Christmas magic, and that's basically the whole thing. But Miracle on 34th Street doesn't do that. Instead, as its story expands, we keep getting these fascinating and odd little looks into different institutions, just like in The Wire. And yeah, tonally it's very different, although maybe not as different as you'd think, and I'm going to get to that later. But look at it this way. So the film's hook is that Kris Kringle, this fellow who believes himself to be Santa Claus, and may very well be Santa Claus, is hired to work as a department store Santa for Macy's. And so yeah, of course this leads to some cute bonding scenes between Kris Kringle and the various kids who come to see him and their parents. And of course it creates this opportunity for him to bond with the child of the single mother, the single working mother who's sort of the central character in the film. Yeah, all that's to be expected, but we also get a lot of scenes about Macy's as a business. And now, don't get me wrong here, these are not hyper serious scenes. It's not as if this film is a documentary on how a department store works. No, this is fundamentally still a family comedy. But nonetheless, you get a lot of scenes that are really kind of fundamentally about corporate politics. You get a moment in the boardroom where Mr. Macy is assessing the strategy of hiring this new Santa Claus and him evaluating the new Santa from a PR perspective. And you get all these funny little scenes of corporate maneuvering and attempts to spin how this Santa Claus is perceived in the media and how that can be used to Macy's advantage. And you also get a lot about the rivalry between Macy's and Gimbel as department stores. And all these things are subtle. These are not things that derail the central heft of the film. But nonetheless, you have this kind of spiraling off. You get to meet all these characters who really live and breathe Macy's as a business and who are primarily motivated by their professional ambition, which is so weird in a Christmas movie. And it's all oddly cynical. And it's all seemingly somewhat tangential to the plot, to the central driving plot of the film. And then a similar thing happens later in the film when Kris Kringle is on trial, when they're assessing his sanity and trying to decide if he should be institutionalized for believing that he's Santa Claus, rather than just remaining tightly focused on Mrs. Walker and her daughter and Fred Daly, who is the love interest and also, of course, the lawyer, and Kris Kringle, and viewing the trial exclusively through their eyes, we get to see little peeks at the lives of all of these other characters associated with the case. We get a look at the life of the district attorney who's trying the case, at the life of the judge who's overseeing the case. We get a look at the political advisor to the judge who's overseeing the case. And that's fascinating. And so we get scenes like the judge being advised on how trying Santa Claus is going to have a negative effect on his re-election campaign, or the relationship between the district attorney and his son, and how the tension there leads into the decisions that he makes about how to try this individual. And even the climatic set piece of the film, the scene that everyone remembers, that famous scene where they carry all the many, many bags of letters to Santa Claus into the courtroom and dump them in front of the judge. Even that scene kind of develops in a similar fashion. We don't just see these letters get delivered to Santa Claus. Instead, we get this little glimpse into the New York City post office where a couple of just random working class guys on the assembly line sorting letters are discussing the situation with the dead letter office and all of these letters to Santa Claus that are piling up and wishing they could do something about it. And we get to see how they have the bright idea of, well, why don't we just dump all these letters on this guy who claims to be Santa Claus? And so even there, we're getting this little peek behind the scenes into an institution that's critical to the overall development of this plot. And not only that, but we get a little candid look into the life of these two characters who otherwise appear nowhere else in the film. They exist just to have this one comic moment, this one funny moment where they discuss the fate of letters to Santa Claus, and then they're gone. And so you can probably see where I'm going with this. That is very similar to how The Wire is structured, in that you get all of these little peeks into these different institutions, and in that the film just keeps expanding and expanding in scope as it goes. The cast of characters keeps expanding, it's not static, and the cast of characters expands along with the world, the universe of the movie. And yeah, obviously The Wire is much darker, much more gritty, much more bleak in the way that it explores these institutions. The Wire is far more dramatic in tone. And yeah, Miracle on 34th Street is, of course, fundamentally a rather lighthearted comedy. And yeah, all these little peeks into different parts of the world of the film are used mostly for comic effect, not to create this overwhelming sense of these rotten and dying institutions. But, even though they're so different in tone, they're not necessarily that different in theme. Which is to say, both The Wire and Miracle on 34th Street seem to have a fairly cynical view of humanity and a fairly cynical view of politics and institutions and business and on what really motivates us. And I don't think I need to clarify the ways in which The Wire is cynical. It's perhaps one of the most cynical television series ever made. But it might be a little bit harder for you to believe me when I say there's something deeply cynical at the core of Miracle on 34th Street. But listen, this is a film where time and time again, characters largely act out of selfish motivations. The Macy's subplot, as I said before, is heavily driven by the ambition and greed of not only Mr. Macy himself, but also the different individuals who work in the different departments of the store. The decision to focus in on this campaign, this advertising campaign, this PR campaign about how their Santa Claus is willing to send families to other stores to buy the Christmas gifts they can't buy at Macy's is not motivated by the goodness of anyone's heart, except Kris Kringle's heart, right? Except Santa Claus's heart. All of the other actors here are thinking about this as a marketing strategy, or thinking about this as a way to build customer loyalty over time. And once again, like I said before, when it gets to the cart room sections, you see that the judge is motivated by political considerations. He makes decisions not just based on what he thinks the letter of the law is and should be, but based instead on his political ambitions, his desire to be reelected. There's an infamous and I think somewhat legally suspect moment in the film where Daly subpoenas the son of the district attorney and gets him to testify as a means to getting the district attorney to concede the existence of Santa Claus. And so in moments like this, we're not getting the impression that these characters have been truly reformed and truly converted, and that they've seen like something fundamental about the spirit of Christmas. Instead, we're seeing them maneuvering in a way that's driven by selfishness. And we're seeing people behave essentially tactically and strategically and cynically. And even Fred Daly himself, who in a different Christmas film would be the unequivocal hero, who would be this well-intentioned, crusading attorney, is sometimes pretty clearly driven by his own self-interest. We see him bragging about the effect that this case is going to have on his career, about how proving this old man is Santa Claus is really going to help him get his leg up in the legal world. And now, of course, it's not that simple and uncomplicated. We also get the impression that Daly is a legitimately good human being who actually cares about Mrs. Walker and her daughter, and who actually has real sympathy and empathy for Kris Kringle. But still, even in the motivations of the film's central hero, there's this little strain of selfishness. There's this little strain of cynicism. And even that big closing set piece that I talked about before with the letters from Santa Claus doesn't come about because the workers at the post office said, hey, you know what? That poor old guy is getting a really bad rap, and I bet he really is Santa Claus, so why don't we send these letters along to help his case? No! It's purely out of personal comfort and a little bit of laziness. It's like, hey, we've got all of these letters here. They're just taking up space. We have to keep sorting them. We have to keep throwing them in the dead letter office. Why don't we just dump them all off on this parsap? It's just a couple of overworked working class guys who see an opportunity to make their lives a little bit easier, make their workload a little bit lighter, and maybe play a fun little prank in the process. And you know, comparisons with The Wire aside, I think this is a big part of what makes Miracle on 34th Street so much more interesting and effective than your average family Christmas film. Because even though it's a lot older than many Christmas films, it already seems to be subverting their formula a little bit. Instead of this straightforward, saccharine story about some cynical businesswoman who goes home and hooks up with some, hometown guy who's simpler and who has a less complicated and more optimistic view of life, and who teaches her somehow the true meaning of Christmas. And instead of this being a simple story about someone's conversion from being selfish and self-centered to being purely selfless and purely driven by the sentiment of the season, we get something that's a lot more messy and a lot more complicated. And yeah, that central formula is still present, is still there, but it's surrounded by this whole universe of characters who have their own motivations, who are short-sighted and myopic and driven in much the same ways that, like, we are. It's not a pure, straight morality tale. And also, that makes it much funnier. It makes the jokes land more effectively because you can see that a lot of the jokes in the film are driven by authentic human foibles and pathos and slight corruption and insecurity and ambition, and are not simply a bunch of pratfalls driven by the plot, driven by some desire to insert some slapstick into an otherwise straightforward story. But aside from tone, there's also one big thematic point on which The Wire and Miracle on 34th Street diverge in their visions. And that's the way in which the selfishness and corruption and pettiness and ambition of the characters within this world ultimately influence the outcome of each of these stories. The overall guiding thematic point of The Wire, if you want to like be crass and assign a point to a piece of art, is basically that all of this personal corruption and all of this institutional corruption snowballs and interconnects in a way that just breeds bad outcomes. That there's this interlocking web of corruption and malice that's rooted not in some great evil intent, but that's rooted in how the short-sighted and selfish and opportunistic choices of individuals working within these institutions all interlock and work together to create a world that is essentially hopeless for the people who occupy it. Whereas all these little selfish, petty choices made in The Miracle on 34th Street actually come together to contribute to the film's happy ending. All these silly little actions that people are taking because they're selfish, because they're short-sighted, because they're thinking about their career or their political ambitions, they all snowball together to produce the miracle in the title of the film. And yes, when Fred Daly and Kris Kringle win their case at the end of the film, and when Fred and Mrs. Walker ultimately do end up being drawn into a romantic relationship, on some level that is out of the goodness of their hearts, especially out of the goodness of Kris Kringle's heart, out of the goodness of Santa Claus's heart. But also, it could not possibly have happened if not for all these small individual characters who were driven entirely solely by their self-interest. And so that's what's miraculous about the film. That's the Christmas miracle at the heart of the film, that all of these people acting in a callous and limited and short-sighted way can be drawn into this interlocking web, not for evil, not for corruption and despair, but for good. And I don't know about you, but to me personally, that's just so much more interesting and, yeah, uplifting than a film where someone goes back to their hometown and learns the true meaning of Christmas, you know, because they met some hunk or whatever. And yeah, I think it makes it not only the better film, but the better Christmas film. And so, yeah, that's it. I'm done. Merry Christmas, I guess. And as usual, thank you. Thank you for watching this video all the way through. If you could, if you feel like it, if you're really in the Christmas spirit, maybe hit that like button, maybe hit that subscribe button even, maybe leave a comment. I appreciate all the insightful comments that I've gotten on all my videos. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks so much. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Whatever. I don't know. Are we doing this? Are we doing this? No, we're not doing this. We're not doing that.